When a grizzly bear's claws tear through your back so deeply that white bone shows through red muscle, when your leg snaps like kindling, when teeth puncture your throat and you taste blood flooding your mouth, pain doesn't just hurt, it screams. And in August of 1823, somewhere along the Grand River in present-day South Dakota, Hugh Glass heard that scream from inside his own body. The bear was protecting her cubs. Hugh Glass was just scouting ahead of his group, hunting for game to feed the expedition, when he stumbled into the worst place a man can be in grizzly country, between a mother and her young. The sow was massive, probably around 400 pounds of muscle, claws, and pure protective rage. She charged before Glass could fire his rifle. What happened next lasted maybe 2 minutes, maybe less. Time stops meaning much when you're being mauled. The bear rose on her hind legs, towering over Glass, and struck. Her claws, each one 4 inches long, raked across his face and scalp. He tried to fight back. Later accounts say he managed to wound her with his knife, but fighting a grizzly at close range is like fighting an avalanche. You don't win. You just try not to die. She knocked him down, pinned him, bit into his throat. Her weight crushed his leg, snapping the bone. Her claws opened his back from shoulders to hips, cutting so deep that ribs showed through the torn flesh. Blood poured from dozens of wounds. Glass screamed for help, and miraculously, his companions heard him and came running. They shot the bear, killing her before she could finish what she'd started. But as they gathered around Glass, looking at the devastation of his body, every man there knew the same thing. He was going to die. It was just a question of when. Hugh Glass was about 40 years old in 1823, though nobody knew for certain. Records about mountain men were sparse, and Glass's origins are mostly speculation. He was probably born around 1783 in Pennsylvania to Scotch-Irish parents. He'd lived a hard life on the frontier, working as a fur trapper, trader, and scout. He knew the wilderness as well as any white man alive. But none of that knowledge could save him from wounds like these. The expedition leader, Andrew Henry, faced an impossible decision. They were in hostile territory. Arikara warriors had attacked them just months earlier, killing several men. Staying in one place too long meant death for the whole group. But moving Glass, with injuries this severe, would kill him faster. The litter they'd built to carry him slowed them to a crawl. Every hour they delayed, they were all in greater danger. Henry made the call that seemed logical and humane. They'd leave 2 men behind to stay with Glass until he died, then bury him and catch up with the group. He offered payment to anyone willing to volunteer. 2 men stepped forward: John Fitzgerald, an older, experienced trapper, and Jim Bridger, a kid of about 19 who'd later become one of the most famous mountain men in American history, but was now just a teenager on his first expedition. For 2 days, maybe 3, Fitzgerald and Bridger sat with Hugh Glass while he lay dying. Except Glass didn't die. He drifted in and out of consciousness, burning with fever, occasionally groaning with pain. But his heart kept beating. His chest kept rising and falling. And all the while, Fitzgerald and Bridger were increasingly terrified that Arikara warriors would find them. The decision they made has echoed through nearly 200 years of American history. They took Glass's rifle. They took his knife and his possibles bag with all his supplies. They wrapped him in the bear hide that had been placed over him as a makeshift shroud. And they left him there, alone, to die in the wilderness. When they caught up with the main expedition, they reported that Glass had finally succumbed to his injuries, and they'd buried him. They collected their payment, and they moved on, probably believing they'd never hear about Hugh Glass again. But Hugh Glass woke up. Nobody knows exactly when. Hours later, maybe a full day. He woke to find himself alone, wrapped in a bearskin, with wounds that should have killed him, and no weapons or supplies to help him survive. The nearest American settlement was Fort Kiowa, somewhere around 200 miles to the southeast along the Missouri River. 200 miles of open prairie, river crossings, and hostile territory. Most men would have given up right there, would have closed their eyes and let death come. But Hugh Glass was not most men. He set his own broken leg. Think about that. Your femur is snapped, bone grinding against bone with every tiny movement, and you have to manipulate it back into alignment without anesthesia, without splints, without help. Just your hands and your will, and pain beyond what most people can imagine. Glass set his leg because if he didn't, he'd never move again. His back was torn open so deeply that his ribs were visible through the wounds. Deep gashes covered his body. His throat had been punctured. Infection was already setting in. He could smell it, the sickly sweet rot of flesh dying while still attached to living tissue. That smell is one of the most distinctive harbors of impending death, and Glass could smell it on himself. He began to crawl. Not walk, crawl. On his belly, dragging himself forward inches at a time, using his arms to pull his broken body across the ground. The pain must have been unimaginable. Every movement tore at damaged tissue. Every breath hurt. But he crawled. What did he eat? At first, almost nothing. His throat was damaged, swallowing was agony, and there was nothing to eat anyway. He drank from streams when he could reach them. He found berries, wild plums, buffalo berries, whatever grew in late summer on the Dakota plains. He ate insects when he could catch them. He ate roots he dug up with his bare hands. And here's the detail that makes people's stomachs turn. He let maggots clean his wounds. The deep lacerations on his back were infected, filled with dead tissue that would kill him if it wasn't removed. In the 1820s, there was no antibiotic, no surgical debridement. But maggots eat dead flesh while leaving living tissue alone. So Glass, in what might be the most cold-blooded act of medical self-care in history, allowed maggots to infest his wounds and eat away the rotting meat. It probably saved his life. The first week was the worst. Glass could barely move. He'd crawl a few dozen yards, then have to rest for hours. His broken leg screamed with every movement. The fever came and went, bringing delirium that made the world swim and blur. He'd drift into unconsciousness, wake up hours later, and force himself to keep moving. Somewhere around a week into his ordeal, Glass's luck changed slightly. He came across wolves that had just killed a buffalo calf. He waited, watching from a distance while the pack gorged themselves. When they left, Glass dragged himself to the carcass and took what remained, maybe half the calf. It was the first substantial food he'd had since the bear attack. He stayed near that carcass for days, eating, resting, letting his body begin the slow process of healing. The protein from the meat gave him strength. The rest let his body redirect energy from basic survival to starting the repair of damaged tissue. When the meat was gone and beginning to spoil too badly even for a desperate man, Glass continued his crawl. The second week was marginally better. He could move a bit faster. The wounds on his back were scabbing over, painfully, pulling with every movement, but healing. His leg was still broken, still agonizing, but he'd learned to drag it in a way that minimized the worst pain. He was still crawling more than walking, but now he could cover a few miles in a day instead of a few dozen yards. Somewhere on the plains, Glass encountered a group of Lakota Sioux. This could have been his death. He was utterly helpless, armed with nothing, unable to run or fight. But these particular Lakota were friendly toward fur traders. They gave him food. According to some accounts, they gave him a knife or helped him build a crude raft or skin boat for traveling down the river. The historical record is unclear on exactly what they gave him, but their help was real and probably essential to his survival. By the third or fourth week, Glass had reached the Missouri River. Water travel was easier than crawling across land. The current did most of the work. He could float downstream for hours, conserving his strength, making real progress toward Fort Kiowa. His wounds were still terrible, but no longer immediately life-threatening. The infection had been defeated, either by the maggots or by his own stubborn immune system, or by sheer luck. His leg was healing crooked, but healing nonetheless. By the sixth week, around mid-October of 1823, Hugh Glass limped into Fort Kiowa. The people there couldn't believe what they were seeing. This walking corpse of a man, scarred beyond recognition, emaciated, broken, but alive. They'd heard he was dead. Fitzgerald and Bridger had reported it, and here he was, having crawled and floated and dragged himself 200 miles through wilderness that should have killed him a dozen different ways. Glass recovered at the fort. Slowly, painfully, but he recovered. His leg healed crooked. He'd walk with a limp for the rest of his life. The scars on his back were horrific, a permanent record of the day a grizzly tried to kill him, and almost succeeded. His throat bore marks where teeth had punctured it. But he was alive. And he had unfinished business. 2 men had abandoned him to die, had stolen his rifle and knife, had left him helpless in the wilderness. For 6 weeks, hatred had fueled Glass's survival almost as much as the will to live. He'd crawled 200 miles partly to stay alive, but also to make those men answer for what they'd done. He bought a rifle and ammunition. He asked where he could find John Fitzgerald and Jim Bridger, and he set out to track them down. He found Bridger first, at a remote fort somewhere in the winter wilderness. Bridger was terrified when he realized who'd just walked through the door. The ghost he'd left for dead, impossibly alive, and looking for revenge. But Glass looked at the kid and saw what Bridger was. 19 years old, scared, following Fitzgerald's lead. Glass, who'd just survived the impossible through sheer force of will, found something inside himself that was harder than revenge. He forgave Bridger, told him he understood, let him live. Fitzgerald was different. Fitzgerald was the one who'd made the decision, who'd convinced young Bridger to abandon their companion. Glass tracked him down, ready to settle accounts. But Fitzgerald had joined the U.S. Army, and Army personnel were protected from civilian retaliation. Glass couldn't touch him without facing military justice himself. Some accounts say Glass accepted a $300 settlement instead of revenge. Others say he simply walked away, his quest for vengeance unfulfilled, but his survival complete. The story of Hugh Glass became legend almost immediately. The first account was published in 1825 in The Portfolio, a Philadelphia literary journal. Other versions followed in newspapers across the country. Each telling added details, embellished facts, turned the story into something more mythic than real. By the time Hugh Glass died, killed by Arikara warriors around 1833 near Fort Cass in Montana, his story had grown larger than the man himself. How much of it is true? The core facts are solid. Glass was mauled by a grizzly in August 1823. He was abandoned by companions. He made it to Fort Kiowa through an incredible feat of survival. He confronted the men who'd left him. The rest, the exact details of his crawl, what he ate, how he survived, those details come from accounts that vary considerably and were written years after the fact. Some of it is probably accurate, some is certainly embellished. All of it has entered American mythology as one of the greatest survival stories ever told.